Hello and welcome back to Tierah Ruins Things with Science. I am Tierah, here again to ruin your favorite movies and TV shows that mention infectious diseases by comparing them to the actual science. I have a degree in immunology and a master's in medical science, and I love watching movies and TV shows, so this podcast was kind of a natural thing for me. Today is a big one, a disease that has unambiguously changed our world, both by numbers of people who are no longer with us and by the fraught political atmosphere its spread produced. There's probably going to be a lot of deeply affecting material in this episode because there's a good chance you know someone who's been affected by this disease, as I do myself. I'm going to be covering HIV as depicted in the movie Philadelphia, which was the first major Hollywood film that talked about the epidemic, barely 10 years after it started. There are many other movies that are about or have characters living with HIV, ones you may know including The Dallas Buyers Club, Boys on the Side, Rent, Precious, Kids, The Cure. Also many TV shows and musicals that have had HIV and AIDS as a plot point too. ER did a particularly good job of showing the social impact of someone living with the disease in the 90s. A disease this impactful cannot help but change our culture and who we are as a people. I can't go through all of the shows and movies in detail, but after I covered the most famous one, you should be able to watch some of the others and then maybe make an informed judgment about them yourself. At least that's my hope. Philadelphia is available to rent on Amazon Prime and Apple TV, so go watch it and let's get going.
That right there in your forehead.
Oh, I got whacked in the head with a racquetball.
The first thing I'm going to say here, which I've said before, is that I cannot cover the history aspects that don't relate to the disease itself and do it justice, since I have not studied history or sociology. Things like the social impact, political histories and policies, and things that led to decisions, the broad context for the world when the events happened, I can touch on them and mention things, but I know there will be significance or context or things that I may miss, and I apologize for that in advance. This is a podcast about infectious diseases, so that is where my main focus will lie. I'm going to do my best to set the scene, though, for what happened as HIV was discovered, where the medicine sat in 1993 when the movie came out, and where we are pretty certain that HIV came from. I have a ton of links in the sources to read more about this if you want to, and please do. There are a lot of really important stories to be told by the people who own that history. It is not my history, though. I am cisgender and hetero. I'm also white and of British nationality, so I've got a bunch of strikes against me. But I am a woman and I have autism, so I do know what it feels like to belong to a group that has not historically held power and does not fit in with the norm or the typical. And I know what it feels like to have those in power openly call for your extermination. To have scientific papers published that blame your mother for your existence, as if you're broken or damaged, and to have parents say that they'd rather risk their kids being dead than have this condition. I think it's important in this case that 2S LGBTQ plus people have their own voices heard in their own words. Thus, the big list of links that I will provide you so you can go and do that. The movie, I feel, does a pretty good job for 1993 at showing the reality, and it even cast many local people living with HIV in the movie as extras. So a lot of what you see in the HIV and AIDS patients is not makeup. The first clarification I want to make is about what HIV and AIDS means, because they are not the same thing. HIV is the name of the virus. It stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus, and AIDS, AIDS, is the name of the syndrome that develops when you have untreated HIV. It stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. HIV is the virus, and AIDS is the cluster of signs and symptoms that arise from having a virus that has destroyed your immune system, making you immunodeficient. You can have HIV and not have AIDS, as many people living with the virus do now since we have medications that can control it. Next, there are dozens of groups and strains of HIV. Some spread less easily than others due to variations in protein structure or enzymes. The major group worldwide that causes pandemic HIV is HIV-1 Group M, which stands for Maine. I have sources, of course, if you want to learn more about the different varieties, but I probably won't be covering them all too much. So unless I say something else, I am referring to HIV 1 Group M. The first report of what would become known as HIV and AIDS was published on June 5th, 1981, in the CDC's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. RIP to that because it's recently been canceled. The MMWR, as it's known, is the way the CDC used to get case reports and other information about diseases and spread of infections out to healthcare practitioners fast. Typically, the regular publication process for journal articles can take 6 to 12 months, and that's far, far too long for getting new info out about emerging diseases and trends. So the MMWR is or was the frontier for case reports and notices. In early 1981, Dr. Michael Gottlieb was working at the UCLA Medical Center as an immunology professor. He was asking his colleagues for interesting teaching cases when he was made aware of a few patients with unexplained fevers, weight loss, oral candida infection, also known as thrush, and virtually no helper T cells detectable in their blood. Those are the T cells that help your immune system recognize threats. The patients also all had or developed pneumonia from Pneumocystis carinii, which is a fungus, and this is called pneumocystis pneumonia or PCP. They also had an infection with cytomegalovirus or CMV. And PCP, oral thrush, and CMV are all things that your immune system should be able to handle and eliminate on its own without you getting sick. Asterisk that in regards to thrush, because people, especially women, can get thrush even if they have a fully functional and competent immune system, which in that case more likely has to do with the normal microbiota being out of balance somehow. You can get oral thrush after being on antibiotics for longer than, a couple weeks, although that does vary person to person and what antibiotics and dose they're on. So please don't panic and start thinking you've got HIV if you get thrush. Speak to your doctor. After this initial report was published, several of the patients went on to develop Kaposi's sarcoma, which is a rare type of skin cancer usually only seen in people with a suppressed immune system, such as those who've received an organ transplant and are taking immunosuppressive drugs to prevent rejection. Immune suppression is the commonality here. Unfortunately, this cluster of patients that Dr. Gottlieb was told about with unexplained immune suppression were all gay men. So when Gottlieb published his report, several other physicians also came forward with reports of similar immune suppression in their own patients who were also gay men. And so the new syndrome became known almost immediately as gay cancer, gay plague, or gay-related immunodeficiency, also pronounced GRID. This created the public perception that this was only a problem for gay men and allowed lawmakers and everyday people to disregard it out of homophobia. It was barely a year later when a report was published showing that people with hemophilia were also experiencing the same issues. In December 1981 and 1982, two different reports were published of infants experiencing the same syndrome, many of whom who had received blood transfusions. And yet these reports were largely ignored because the first impression of the syndrome was that it was the gay disease. Let's take it back before Gottlieb's first report in 1981 for a minute. The Stonewall Uprising was in 1969. Almost half of the states in the U.S. had still criminalized sodomy in the 70s and 80s. In 1980, evangelical Christian leaders in the U.S. sent a letter to President Jimmy Carter demanding a stop to the progression of gay rights, such as laws that protected against discrimination in the workplace. That fall, Ronald Reagan was elected, and Reagan was an ally to a group called Moral Majority, an American political organization founded by the televangelist Jerry Falwell in 1979, specifically because he thought that the separation of church and state was stupid, and he wanted to change that. Do you remember the Green Day song Minority that came out in about 2000? Down with the moral majority because I want to be the minority? I don't have any proof that that line is about the same organization, but I like to think it is. That's the environment that was in the air when these reports of unexplained immunodeficiency started being published. On October 15th, 1982, so about a year after the first MMWR, Reagan's press secretary, Larry Speakes, was asked by a journalist called Lester Kinsolving about whether or not the president was tracking the spread of AIDS, saying it was known as the gay plague, there were over 600 cases so far, and that over a third of those had died. This was just a month or so after the CDC finally coined the term AIDS in September that year. Press Secretary Speakes laughed at the journalist who asked the question and badgered him about whether or not he had the disease. They made jokes about the president not being gay, so of course he had no knowledge of it. I'm going to play a clip of this question. The full video is on Vanity Fair's YouTube for free, and I've linked it in the sources. The sound is a little wonky, it's not balanced that great, but it's an old clip, so just bear with me.
Does the President have any reaction to the announcement of the Center for Disease Control of Atlanta that AIDS is now an epidemic, over 600 cases? And over a third of them are gone. It's known as gay plague. No, it is. I mean, it's a pretty serious thing that 1 in every 3 people that get this have died, and I wonder if the President is aware of it.
I don't have it. Are you? Do you?
You don't have it. Well, I'm relieved to hear that, Larry.
Do you?
Speakes was a real piece of shit. Kinsolving was a religious man who had used derogatory words to refer to gay rights activists in the past, but he was the first person to ask the government about the AIDS epidemic, and he persisted in the face of laughter and other homophobic comments that were made in the room to try to drown him out. But, broken clock right twice a day and all that, so we award him no points for his persistence. President Reagan did go on to sign several bills that authorized federal funding of HIV research in 1983, but he would not make a public statement on AIDS or form a commission to work on the epidemic until 1987. That is 6 years after it first started. In 1987 alone, over 10,000 people died in the U.S. from HIV. It caused 11% of all deaths for men aged 25 to 44 that year. Even in the face of that number, his government's eventual response to HIV amounted to spending a lot of money to tell people to not have sex, versus giving actual helpful advice on how the virus is and isn't spread. On May 20th, 1983, Dr. Françoise Barré-Sinoussi, working at the Pasteur Institute in France, reported the discovery of a retrovirus that could be the cause of AIDS. Barré-Sinoussi was correct in her discovery, and she received the Nobel Prize in 2008 for it. The virus was officially named HIV and given its own classification group a few years later in May 1986. Also in May 1983, the U.S. Congress passed the first funding of $12 million for HIV/AIDS research. That's about $37 million today, which is not a lot. Currently, or I should say up until 2024, over $28 billion a year was invested into HIV research by the U.S. government. I honestly don't know what the total would be now in 2025, but I bet you it's not that much. The following year, in March 1984, the American Journal of Medicine examined a cluster of 40 AIDS patients with Kaposi sarcoma and delved into their sexual contacts. They made a report and listed one as patient O for outside California. The report states that this man was a flight attendant and that he'd had sex with 8 other men in the study, and that he was the first person of this group to show symptoms. This report was heavily misconstrued by the media, and patient O was misread as patient 0, leading to the widespread belief that this unnamed flight attendant was the first person to start spreading HIV in the U.S. The man's name was Gaetan Dugas, and he was a French-Canadian flight attendant for Air Canada. Journalist Randy Shilts, who you may know from his biography of Harvey Milk, also wrote a book called And the Band Played On, a book about the early days of the AIDS crisis, which was turned into a documentary of the same name. In it, he implies that Dugas was intentionally spreading the disease, knowingly infecting people, and was responsible for spreading it coast to coast. Shilts himself was an openly gay man, the first one to work at the San Francisco Chronicle, which would have been really hard in the 80s, and he fell prey to the attractive idea that there was a single person or single event responsible for bringing HIV and AIDS to humanity. I understand that feeling, honestly, I do. To want to have some place to lay blame, to say, If only this one thing had been different, this terrible thing wouldn't have happened. If you want to learn more about the myth of Patient Zero, watch the documentary Killing Patient Zero. It's on Amazon Prime. Unfortunately, the story of HIV transferring to humans and its journey to the US cannot be blamed on one single incident, and certainly not on one person, let alone Gaetan Dugas. There were many different steps that fell into place, and retroactively, many people have been discovered to have died from HIV long before it was known or officially discovered. One of those was Grete Rask, a Danish physician who spent years working in the Congo. She died in 1977 of pneumonia after several years of suffering from a number of opportunistic infections and severe immunodeficiency. Blood samples of hers were kept and analyzed in 1987, showing that she did have HIV. Same thing for a teenager who died in 1969 in St. Louis. That was a 16-year-old boy named Robert Rayford, and he died of AIDS, and in 1987 his tissue samples were analyzed and confirmed to have been infected with HIV. Interesting point, the article from 1987 that reported on this was written by Gina Kolata, who you met last episode in the 1918 influenza. In 1976, a Norwegian sailor named Arne Rode, sorry for my pronunciation, he died of complications after being infected with HIV, probably in Cameroon in the early 1960s, where he was known to have visited sex workers and where HIV is known to have been prevalent at the time. In April 1980, a man named Ken Horn died of Kaposi sarcoma and is retroactively again shown to have had HIV. All of these examples show that Gaetan Dugas was hardly the first person to have had HIV or to have exhibited symptoms in the US. But the attractive desire to assign blame, to have the source for one's suffering, was too much for Schiltz. Randy Schiltz died of AIDS-related illnesses in 1994, just after this movie was released. In July 1984, the CDC issued a report stating that IV drug use and needle sharing can cause transmission of the virus. They knew that the virus could be spread by blood products. They knew this in 1982 when the CDC made a report of heterosexual men with hemophilia who were dying of PCP, pneumocystis pneumonia, not to mention those infants dying of the same illnesses. However, in October 1984, the New York Times reported that AIDS was transmissible through saliva, and it took 2 years for that to be officially disproven. There are probably people out there right now who still believe that, but it is not true. In July of 1985, actor Rock Hudson announced that he had AIDS. He was the first major public figure to do so, and he died a few months later. Rock Hudson was one of the original Hollywood heartthrobs. It was kind of an open secret that he was gay. He was like Jensen Ackles, Pedro Pascal, and Alan Ritchson all rolled into one. It was appalling to the nation when he announced that he had AIDS. People were pretty shook. In his will, he left some money to set up the American Foundation for AIDS Research, or AMFAR, with his friend Elizabeth Taylor, yes, that Elizabeth Taylor, as its founding national chairperson. At the same time in 1985, governments were being authorized to close bathhouses, bars, and clubs where, quote, high-risk sexual activity takes place. At the end of the year, an LA Times article was published stating that a majority of Americans think that people with HIV should be quarantined, licensed, and/or tattooed, indicating their HIV status. Great. In 1986, a report from the Surgeon General Everett Koop was released that stated that HIV cannot be spread casually through touch or breathing on someone or kissing them, and that greater education was needed. Dr. Koop was a Reagan appointee and an evangelical Christian who disliked gay people, but he also happened to believe that public health care came first and sent out a mailer to all homes in the country detailing the facts about AIDS. The Institute of Medicine also called for a massive nationwide public education campaign that same month in order to try and reduce transmission. The Reagan government was pissed at Dr. Koop for this, and in 1987 released their own campaign that basically amounted to just don't have sex. Which, for a disease that can be spread other ways is not helpful. But finally, some good news comes in March 1987. The first medication for HIV, azithromycin, or AZT, is released. It works by inhibiting the reverse transcriptase enzyme that takes the virus's RNA genome and turns it into DNA, which is then inserted by a different enzyme called integrase into the nuclear DNA of your T cells, resulting in the incurable infection. I will talk more about this in just a little bit. I am just trying to get us right now to the state of the disease in 1993. In April 1987, Princess Diana makes international headlines for shaking hands with an AIDS patient. This moment in history was groundbreaking. In a time when most people still thought that AIDS was spread from handshaking or kissing, even though we already knew it wasn't, the impact of this picture cannot really be understated. Unfortunately, less than a month later, the U.S. Public Health Service added HIV to its immigration exclusion list, preventing anyone from immigrating there who had HIV. And this ban was not lifted until 2010. That's a bad thing, because what if you're a refugee fleeing persecution for being gay, or fleeing a war zone and you also happen to be HIV positive? Do you not also deserve to escape your situation? Throughout the 80s, there were many lawsuits and fights with school boards where children who had caught HIV from blood transfusions and were not allowed to enroll at their schools, including one case of the three Ray brothers, Ricky, Robert, and Randy, whose home was burned down deliberately after the ruling that said they should be allowed to go to school. In July 1990, U.S. Congress finally enacted the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, which prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities, including those with illnesses such as HIV or AIDS. In November 1991, Magic Johnson, the basketball player, announced he has HIV. Magic Johnson is still alive, by the way, and he has always maintained that he doesn't know where he caught HIV from, just that he had a lot of female companionship while he was in his early career. That same month, November 1991, Freddie Mercury from Queen died of pneumonia after developing AIDS. In 1992, the CDC announced that HIV/AIDS is now the leading cause of death for men aged 25 to 44 in the U.S. By 1994, it would be the leading cause of death for all Americans. In 1992, Bill Clinton was elected president, having campaigned that he would make a national AIDS strategy a priority for his administration. Without getting into too much political history that, again, I'm not educated about, I'll just say that I think Clinton's eventual record on HIV was mixed, let's say. So that's where we were in 1993 in the US. I haven't even talked about the contaminated blood scandals going on throughout the US, the UK, and Canada, and I honestly don't think I'll have time to go into that, but I will provide links. To sum it up, the U.S. prison system would, quote, solicit blood products from its prisoners and then sell those blood products domestically and internationally to places like the Red Cross. There's a whole other podcast in here to talk about the lack of informed consent for prisoners in that scenario, but I can't get into it right now. Also, the blood wasn't tested for everything, and that's why everyone was getting HIV and other infections from blood transfusions. In Canada, people mainly caught HIV and hepatitis C. The investigation into this was called the Creever Inquiry, and it happened in 1993. The Canadian Red Cross Society was found to have been negligent in not testing the blood for diseases even when tests had become available to do so. The first test to detect HIV was developed in 1985, by the way. This is why in Canada we don't have the Red Cross managing our blood banks and donation system anymore. It's Canadian Blood Services, because 2,000 people contracted HIV and 30,000 people got hepatitis C. By 1994, 33,000 Canadians were known to be living with HIV. That's about 1 in every 1,000 people. Probably many more unknowns. In the UK, the Infected Blood Inquiry investigation just released its final report in summer 2024, showing that 30,000 people got HIV, hepatitis C, or both from contaminated blood. For some good news, I want to mention a Canadian doctor, Dr. Dick Smith, who was one of the few doctors willing to treat LGBTQ+ patients in the 1980s in Winnipeg, Manitoba. He died in 2023 from pancreatic cancer at the age of 80. He was gay and spent his career advocating for his gay patients, starting outreach societies and fundraising and holding testing clinics. He was a trailblazer and a Canadian hero, just like the American Dr. Michael Gottlieb, the man who first published the report on AIDS in 1981. Gottlieb also made it his career to treat gay patients with AIDS. He was Rock Hudson's physician. He got one of the first government grants to study the virus in the US. He also wasn't shy about talking about the virus publicly or his research, and this made his colleagues at UCLA very nervous. UCLA wanted to be known as a center for complex organ transplants, and the administrators and Gottlieb's colleagues were worried that if Gottlieb got too well known for speaking about AIDS, patients wouldn't want to come there for a transplant because they'd be going to the AIDS hospital. Gottlieb was denied tenure in 1987, so he went into private practice where he continued to do what he wanted, which was treat AIDS patients. He is one of the founders of AMFAR, again, the organization created with a bequest from Rock Hudson and headed by Elizabeth Taylor.
The HIV virus can only be transmitted through the exchange of bodily fluids, namely blood, semen, and vaginal secretions.
Now it's time for a little biology. Before I tell you where we're pretty sure this virus came from, let me tell you the basics of the virus's biology, and then we'll talk about the movie. So HIV is a retrovirus, and retroviruses are part of the group lentiviruses. Other lentiviruses you may have heard of are dengue, yellow fever, Zika. I've got a big chart and I'll put it in the sources. I think it's around number 44 if you want to see it. And you should if you're a big nerd like me and you want to lose an hour of your life zooming into a massive poster all about viruses. Retroviruses are a little different from dengue or Zika in that, yes, they all use RNA as their genome rather than DNA. But once a retrovirus infects your cells, it immediately turns that RNA genome into DNA, which it then integrates into your cell's DNA in the nucleus using a specialized enzyme called integrase. Regular RNA or DNA viruses don't do this. They don't have the reverse transcriptase or integrase enzymes, so they just hang out in your cell and replicate and burst and move on to infect again. We call this retro, RNA turning into DNA, because the capital C, capital D central dogma of biology is that DNA becomes RNA, becomes protein, and retroviruses do this backwards. In your cell, you have DNA, and when you need to produce a protein like a neurotransmitter or insulin or an enzyme to digest food or control hunger, your DNA opens up from its tightly coiled cluster and it transcribes that into RNA, more accurately known as messenger RNA or mRNA, because it contains the message of how to make the protein that you need. This mRNA is taken to a ribosome outside the nucleus, where it is translated into an amino acid sequence, which is then folded into a protein. DNA becomes RNA, becomes protein. This is how everything works except for retroviruses. Immunodeficiency retroviruses in apes and monkeys are called simian immunodeficiency viruses, or SIVs. They're probably somewhat younger than we originally thought, a few hundred years as opposed to thousands or millions. There's this whole side of the story where originally in the mid-1900s through the 90s, scientists thought that SIVs did not cause disease in monkeys and apes, like they didn't get monkey AIDS, which would mean that the virus had been with them a really long time and had evolved to not be pathogenic or to kill them. That's what happens when a virus or disease is in a species for a long time. We know now that that's not true and that monkeys and apes do experience immunodeficiency from SIV similar to humans. There's a lot more detail on that in The Chimp and the River, a book which I will mention again later. HIV infection is, dare I say this, at the risk of upsetting all the other immunologists and people who study it, a simple process. Essentially, I've already told you how it happens. The virus is transmitted to a new person across a mucous membrane, through blood-to-blood contact, or through pregnancy and birth, and sometimes, rarely, through breast milk. The most common is a mucosal service, which means that it's a sexually transmitted disease. There was an old CSI episode of the original series where a murderer was caught because he contracted HIV from the woman he killed when her blood splashed into his eyes as he was trying to make a snuff film. But I think that would probably be covered under mucosal service contact. Once the virus is in your blood, it infects a certain type of T cell. I will try not to get too deep into the immunology lore here, but you have T cells, and there are many different jobs for these T cells, two of which are helper T and killer T cells. You might have already heard of helper and killer cells referred to as CD4 or CD8 cells. Those are their government names, while helper and killer describe their functions. Just as an aside, CD means cluster of differentiation, and a CD is a protein or proteins on a cell surface that allow us to tell the different types of cells apart based on what they do or what their job is. There are hundreds of these protein clusters, and I just mentioned it in case you wanted to know what that meant. You're probably also going to hear that term multiple times on this podcast if you listen long time, so it's a good thing to know. HIV infects your helper T cells, the CD4s, by attaching to the CD4 proteins on the cell surface and to an accessory receptor called CCR5. This allows the viral envelope to fuse to the cell surface and dump its contents into the cell, and then the whole reverse transcription and integration thing happens. Then, the virus promotes its own transcription. It forces your cell to make copies of it to form new viral RNA and proteins. Those get assembled and they bud off of the host cell to go out and infect other T cells. There are a ton of accessory proteins in there that guide each step and are the targets for different treatment drugs. During the acute phase of HIV infection, which is the first 2 to 4 weeks, most people will experience a series of mild flu-like illnesses or symptoms. It'll be like getting a cold over and over again. The HIV virus replication is very high, and it's flowing throughout your blood, infecting every new CD4 T cell that it encounters very rapidly. When it buds off and goes out to spread to a new cell, this kills the cell, and it causes their numbers to decline. Then, when most of the CD4s are dead and viral replication is low, the CD4 numbers kind of tend to recover a little bit, though not to their pre-infection levels. This is the chronic stage, and a patient may not have any AIDS symptoms at all. This stage can last anywhere from 2 to 10 years, right? But eventually, when a person is not being treated for HIV, the viral replication overtakes the CD4 rate of production as they die, and they're not replaced fast enough. And then the CD4 count in the blood drops below 200 cells per milliliter of blood. Whereas normally you have 500 to 1500 cells per mil, so that's very low. And it heavily impairs the activation of the rest of your immune system because the CD4's main job is to tell the CD8 T cells and the B cells and the rest of the immune system that there is an infection. The person with HIV gets to the point where they can't fight those other infections, and then they will typically pass away from those other things. Those infections are things I've already mentioned and are collectively known as AIDS-defining illnesses. Things that are so rare to see in healthy people that they are practically diagnostic of active HIV. That's the Kaposi's sarcoma, the oral thrush, active cytomegalovirus infection, various types of pneumonia and lung infections, usually with fungus, molds, or parasites, other lymphomas and cancers, and reactivation of chronic latent infections like herpes or toxoplasmosis. As always, there is a list in the sources. So no, someone doesn't necessarily die of the HIV infection due to the virus directly, but it leaves you without defenses against everything else. Bobby Campbell was one of the first outspoken AIDS advocates. He died in 1984 of cryptosporidiosis, an intestinal single-celled parasite. Liberace died of a cytomegalovirus pneumonia in 1987, and Amanda Blake, who played Miss Kitty on the show Gunsmoke, died of CMV hepatitis in 1989. Freddie Mercury died of bronchial pneumonia in 1991, as did Anthony Perkins in 1992. He played the original Norman Bates in Psycho. Gia Karanji, the first supermodel in 1989, and Eazy-E from NWA in 1995 also died of HIV-related pneumonia. Isaac Asimov died of heart and kidney failure related to HIV in 1992. Fashion designers Perry Ellis and Halston both died of Kaposi's sarcoma, Ellis in 1986 and Halston in 1990. Robert Reed, who was the father on the Brady Bunch, died of HIV-related bowel cancer in 1992. Steve Rubel, who helped found the infamous Studio 54, he died of AIDS-related hepatitis and septic shock in 1989. Tom Fogarty, one of the founding members of Creedence Clearwater Revival, died of HIV-related tuberculosis in 1990. There are millions more whose names I don't know. maybe who no one knows, or who didn't even know they had HIV.
And they don't want to fire you for having AIDS, so in spite of your brilliance, they make you look incompetent, thus the mysterious lost file. Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Correct. I was sabotaged.
In the movie Philadelphia, Tom Hanks plays a lawyer named Andrew Beckett, who is fired from his job after being set up, he alleges, to take the fall for almost losing an important document that needed to be filed against a deadline. He visits 9 lawyers before going to one that he had previously argued against to ask for help. That lawyer is Joe Miller, played by Denzel Washington, and he initially refuses the case because he's homophobic. There's a long scene where Joe talks with his wife over not wanting the case because of his unapologetic homophobia. But then, Joe happens to be in the same law library as Andrew and observes him being discriminated against, and he decides to actually have empathy and step in because he can understand that it's wrong despite his feelings. The crux of Beckett's case is that some of the partners in his law firm suspected or knew that he had HIV because of a Kaposi's sarcoma lesion on his face, which looked like a large mole. They were visible on his face and neck at the time, just before his firing, and he said that he was set up and fired for being gay, not because he was a bad lawyer. There is a lot that is incredibly accurate in this movie, and it's an Oscar winner for a reason. It was made by Jonathan Demme, who had just won the Best Picture Oscar for Silence of the Lambs. And as I said at the beginning, many of the gay people shown on screen, the actors and extras, like I mentioned, they were employed because they were locals who were gay and living with HIV. Most of those people, unfortunately, did not survive long past the film's release. The lesions that Andrew Beckett had on his face, and eventually that you see on his chest, look exactly like real Kaposi's sarcoma marks. At the beginning of the movie, before Beckett is fired, he's on the phone to his mum, and at one point he assures her that his doctor said his T cells are steady and his platelets are fine. That is a lie. That's what you tell your mother when you don't want to worry her. If a person is progressing to AIDS from an HIV infection, their CD4 counts are not fine. There is one scene early on where Tom Hanks is standing on a sidewalk trying to gather himself before he carries on with his day. And the camera goes in for a close-up, and it's about 30 minutes into the movie, and you can tell that this is the scene that won him the Oscar. If you haven't seen it, you really need to. So the trial starts in the movie, and Beckett is getting sicker and sicker, but eventually he testifies. He's asked if he had heard about the disease at a certain time, which was 1984 or 1985, and he responds that he'd heard vague notions of a gay plague or gay cancer. That fits the timeline that I went through at the top. Remember, HIV wasn't officially named until 1986. AIDS was first reported in 1981. The HIV virus was discovered in 1983, but President Reagan didn't make his first public statement on HIV until 1985. The internet and the 24-hour news cycle, it didn't exist in the 80s, so scientific knowledge would have taken much longer to disseminate through culture back then than it does now, especially considering the stigma attached to talking about HIV and AIDS at the time. You couldn't just subscribe or even really look up easily the weekly morbidity and mortality weekly reports like you can now. People just didn't do it. So, that led to a deep lack of information, a state of just don't talk about it and it'll go away. At one point in the movie, there is a camera pan over to a whiteboard that's covered in a timetable for taking medications. There is a screenshot in the show notes. It lists AZT, azithromycin, the only HIV drug on the market in 1993, to be taken multiple times a day. The other things are drugs to not treat the HIV, but those AIDS-defining illnesses. It shows Nizoral, which is an antifungal shampoo, similar to the name to Nizoral, which is a product you might recognize. I'm not sure if they're different brands or if Nizoral renamed itself or if it's a spelling mistake, but they're the same anyways. They're brand names for a drug called ketoconazole, which is used to treat dandruff. You can also take it internally, though, if nothing else is working to treat your internal fungal infection. There's Megaze with an S, which might be a misspelled Megace with a C, as that's a drug similar to progesterone that's used to stimulate the appetite. Plenty of people with AIDS dramatically lose weight, so they need to gain it back somehow. Then there's acyclovir and ganciclovir. Acyclovir is an antiviral drug that's used to treat herpes simplex and chickenpox. Herpes simplex is something that most of the population has been exposed to, and same with chickenpox at the time. If you don't have a working immune system and those two latent infections were to reactivate, they could cause some very nasty lesions and sores and a lot of pain, so that's to keep them under control. Ganciclovir treats cytomegalovirus infection in people whose immune system is suppressed. CMV is caused by human herpes virus 5, and in most people it doesn't cause disease and just gets eliminated. In babies, it can cause some problems, but if you have no immune system, it can cause pneumonia, as we talked about, but it can also cause retinitis, which is an inflammation of the retina, and that can lead to blindness. Late in the movie, we overhear a doctor telling Beckett's parents that he has lost the vision in his eye, and it's because of the CMV, and that he wasn't going to regain it.
He's lost the vision in his right eye, and because of the CMV, he will not regain his vision.
This is after the trial, and I'm going to spoil the ending in a second here, so here's a short warning. If you haven't seen the movie yet and don't want to be spoiled, hit pause and go watch it now. Miller, the lawyer, he wins the case, and Beckett is awarded almost $5 million in damages for wrongful dismissal. And as he's walking through the hospital to Beckett's room, because Beckett collapsed before the end of the trial, this is when we overhear the doctor talking to Beckett's parents, and there's a lovely callback to the beginning of the movie. At the beginning, Miller's wife had just given birth to a baby, and he was on the phone to someone telling them to get champagne, but not Dom Perignon because it cost $100 a bottle. That's $189 in today's Canadian money. It seems like a lot, but a bottle of Dom is going to cost you around $300 today where I live, so it's not bad. Miller gets to Beckett's hospital room after the verdict, and he walks in. Of course, he's carrying a bottle of Dom Perignon. Miller's a little bit of a sleazy guy at the beginning. He's an ambulance chaser type, but this is the end, and now he's hugging Beckett and Beckett's partner, played by Antonio Banderas, whereas at the start, he wouldn't even shake Beckett's hand, and the one time he did, he stepped back and then wiped his hand on his pants after he realized that Beckett had HIV. Maybe he got the Dom because he just won a $5 million case and it's going to get a fat commission, but I choose to believe it's because he's grown and changed. Miller's character is a stand-in for the audience. The director Jonathan Demme said that they wrote him that way explicitly to get sympathy from their target audience, which is not people who already cared about people living with HIV, but the people who are just like Miller, the ones with prejudices. At the end, we see people wearing red ribbons. This was a symbol that was developed in 1991 to show support for HIV research. And at the Oscars in 1994, when this movie was heavily nominated, many people wore the red ribbons, including Tom Hanks, who spoke about it during his acceptance speech. The impact of this movie was groundbreaking. It did so much to bring the stories of people living with this disease to the forefront, to the mainstream, and to humanize them. I couldn't help but be reminded of early 2020 when Tom Hanks and his wife Rita Wilson announced that they had the virus that would then go on to be known as COVID-19. He was the first major celebrity to announce it, and it made it real to people in a way that it wasn't really yet. It was still early days, but it changed something in the way people acted, as if suddenly they realized anyone could get it and it was a real virus. I mean, obviously not everyone went on to consider it a real virus, but it did impact some people. And I just thought that was a nice parallel. Tom Hanks is out here being a disease ambassador, making people take stuff seriously.
I've heard of a thing, the gay plague, the gay cancer.
Now that I've talked about the virus and the movie, as a bit of an extra, I want to tell you where HIV came from, because I read a lot of background for this podcast, and I'm going to info dump on you, so that wasn't all in vain. HIV did not spring out of nowhere. It is not divine punishment for gay sex. It is not punishment for anything, because illness is not the consequence for doing bad things, unfortunately. Wouldn't it be convenient if all the bad people in the world got sick and died because they were bad? No. HIV is just a virus. It's a chunk of non-sentient RNA and proteins that evolved through millions of years of evolution and natural selection, just like everything else. The 1970s and 80s weren't the beginning of the story. Most of the details I'm about to cover are from a 2014 paper called The Early Spread and Epidemic Ignition of HIV-1 in Human Populations by Nuno Faria et al. David Quammen's book Spillover has a chapter about HIV and AIDS, which he released as a standalone book called The Chimp in the River, which I read. In it, he tells much the same story as the Faria paper. It's a little dramatized, which I will summarize here for you without getting into all of the hypothetical scenarios that he made up. We know that HIV came from chimpanzees because the genetic sequences of the chimp SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus, are very similar. There is another paper I'm linking to called Origins of HIV and the AIDS Pandemic that has a nice little chart in it showing the way all the different SIVs are related, but I'm not going to go over that here. The initial transfer of the virus from chimps to humans happened in southeast Cameroon sometime a few years before 1920. The SIV sequences found in that area are the most similar to HIV group M, which is the pandemic strain. This transfer most likely happened due to the hunting of chimpanzees for meat in a theory known as the cut hunter. A hunter is tracking chimps for meat and gets cut during the process of preparing that meat. Blood from the animal gets into the wound, et voila, a spillover. This probably happened many times to many hunters before one hunter became infected and then traveled a long distance to a big city where he could transmit the virus to other people. From the initial transfer in Cameroon, the virus traveled with the hunter to the Republic of the Congo, which was then known as Zaire. Side note, shout out to another podcast if you want to learn more about the political situation in the Congo and Zaire around the time the virus was making its journey from chimpanzees to humans. Behind the Bastards by Robert Evans has a couple early episodes about King Leopold of Belgium that you can listen to. It was not a great time period, as you can probably tell by the podcast title. But it sort of explains the turbulent history of the area and why different places have changed names and what the culture was like at the time. He doesn't touch on HIV at all, but it gives you the broader social context. I will try to refer to places with their proper names, but please forgive me if I get something wrong. Lots of countries and cities have changed names, and I mean no offense if I accidentally use the colonial one instead of the indigenous one. The virus made its way across the Republic of the Congo to the capital Brazzaville, which is right across the river from Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Kinshasa became the epicenter of the virus. We know this because it has the highest diversity of HIV genetic sequences. The longer a virus has been somewhere, the more diverse it will be because it has had more time to accumulate mutations or mistakes in its genetic sequence from all of the copying and replicating. We estimate that this happened in or around 1920, that the virus had made it to Kinshasa by then, which means the initial transfer probably happened some years earlier, possibly as early as 1908 or 1909. The way we know the years, or can estimate the years in which this happened, is because we have two samples from people who died in the DRC, what was called Zaire, in 1959 and 1960. The genetic sequences of those two samples are different enough that we can estimate how long it took them to diverge from a common ancestor. We know how frequently the virus mutates or makes a mistake when it's replicating, and you just work backwards. Between 1920 and 1960, the virus evolved fairly slowly. It wasn't really spreading that much or that fast, and during that time there was Group M for main and Group O for other. And then something changed. Something happened that made Group M spread at 2 to 3 times the rate that it was before. Two main reasons why viruses or diseases will do this is that they either move into a new population that spreads them better or is more susceptible, or something genetic changes with the virus itself that makes it spread more easily. I think in this case, it's probably a combination of the two. Canadian microbiologist Jacques Pepin wrote a book called The Origin of AIDS, in which he proposes that much of the early spread from 1929 through the 1940s was caused by non-sterilized needles that were reused at the health clinics there. The Congolese Red Cross set up the Le Dispensaire Antivenerien, a place where people could go for treatment for anything from trypanosomiasis to syphilis and gonorrhea to leprosy, and those treatments were given in reused needles that were not sterilized. In the 1920s and 30s, hundreds of thousands of injections for trypanosomiasis were given by the French colonial doctor Eugène Jameau and his team. These non-sterile injections were likely to blame for why there is such a high diversity of HIV sequences in the area. There has been much more spread there in general and more chance for evolution and divergence. I said a moment ago there are two reasons why HIV-1 group M spread so much, and while other strains and groups are not. So groups M and O HIV were present in Kinshasa, but only group M went on to cover the world. And the second reason is because group O and group N, which I haven't mentioned yet, is more susceptible to a human defense protein called tetherin. Tetherin does what it sounds like. It tethers the virus particle to the host cell and doesn't allow it to release to go on and infect a new cell. This means that the virus spreads less well, it replicates less, and therefore transmits less frequently to new people. This might, in fact, be the main reason why HIV group M is dominant, because groups N and O would have been exposed to the non-sterile needles and spread that way also, but only group M was able to use this environment to spread beyond. On June 30th, 1960, Belgium gave up the Republic of Congo as a colony. Decolonization is a very messy affair, to put it mildly, of course, and with the withdrawal of the colonial peoples, this left gaps in all the skilled professions in the country at all levels, because the colonizers didn't allow the indigenous people to be educated. To help with this, the WHO and UNESCO recruited foreign aid to go to the Republic of the Congo to help ease the transition to an independent nation. Approximately 1,000 of these foreign aid workers came from Haiti, and the next 5 years were spent trying to rebuild the Republic of the Congo. But in 1965, a military dictatorship took over, and the country was renamed Zaire. Foreign aid workers were expelled, and when those 1,000 Haitians returned to Haiti, one of them brought back HIV-1 Group M, subtype B, around 1966. In Haiti in the 1960s and 70s, there was a company called Hemo Caribbean, which was owned by an American and paid people to donate plasma. Donating plasma is different from donating blood in that there's a machine that you're hooked up to that separates out your blood cells from your blood and returns the cells to your body while retaining the water and the subcellular things like platelets and antibodies and clotting factors. This lets you donate more frequently, and so people were doing it as a way to make money. Spoiler alert, the machines weren't sterilized properly in between donations, and HIV was spread this way. You're sensing maybe a bit of a theme here with soliciting and paying people for blood donations. It's kind of a bad thing. By 1982, 8% of women visiting a clinic for testing were HIV positive in Haiti. Hundreds of plasma donors were infected, and 5,000 to 6,000 liters of plasma were shipped every month from Haiti to the US for transfusions and other treatments. In 1983, a few months before Françoise Barré-Sinoussi announced she had found the virus that causes AIDS, the CDC released a report stating that high-risk groups for transmission of the virus were gay men with multiple sexual partners, people who use IV drugs, and Haitians, although they didn't know why at the time. From Haiti in 1966, the virus came to Miami around 1969. It came in the blood supply and through Haitian immigrants who carried it, and the virus, moved into hemophiliacs, IV drug users, and gay men. It spread unchecked and unnoticed for a decade before Dr. Michael Gottlieb in 1981 was looking for some interesting teaching cases.
How do you go from a lawyer spotting a lesion, which could have been anything, to the partners deducing that you have AIDS and terminating you on the basis of that conclusion?
As of 2022, more than 85 million people worldwide have been infected with HIV, and about half of those, 40 million, are no longer with us. In 2022 alone, 630,000 people died of HIV-related complications. That number is dropping from the early 2000s when HIV worldwide deaths were in the millions per year, but it's still more than, say, malaria or some cancers like stomach, liver, or breast cancer. It's more than diabetes type 1, but not type 2 related deaths. Amazingly, 718,000 people died of HIV in 2021, so in just 1 year, over 100,000 fewer people were lost. That is all due to the effective antiretroviral treatments that have been developed and delivered to people, so HIV is no longer necessarily a death sentence, provided you have access to the drugs and can take them. You no longer need a whiteboard to track when you have to take all your meds. The days of taking a handful of pills every 4 hours is over. There is no official cure. Taking the treatment is still lifelong. But that does bring me to discuss the few people who have been quote-unquote cured of the disease. Before I can tell you how they were cured, I have to tell you about CCR5. I mentioned that before when I said it was an accessory receptor that the HIV virus particle attaches to in order to enter a CD4 T cell and infect it. Turns out, CCR5 is likely the main receptor for entry to the cell because without it, you are immune to HIV. CCR5 is what's called a chemokine receptor, and a chemokine is a chemical messenger that cells use to send signals to each other to tell them what to do and what is going on. It's like cells texting each other emojis. If you get a smiley face emoji, you know everything's okay. But if you get a broken heart or a crying emoji, you're going to check up on your friend to see what's up. One of these messengers will bind to CCR5 and it helps activate the T cell. That induces it to move towards the infection or the threat, and it can tell it to proliferate or make more T cell copies of itself. There is a mutation in this gene where 32 amino acids are missing from the sequence that creates the protein, resulting in a receptor that is non-functional. And this mutation is called the delta 32, because delta is shorthand for deletions in genetics and science. You've probably heard this, the CCR5 delta 32s. The people who carry 2 copies of this gene are almost 100% resistant to HIV infection. For a long time, we thought that there was no effect from not having this receptor. After all, many humans have this mutation naturally, and they appear to be just fine. Recently, though, it's been discovered there's an association between increased risk of West Nile virus infection and a loss of CCR5. On the opposite end of things, not having CCR5 seems to be associated with a lower risk of graft versus host disease, which is a complication in transplant recipients, so a lower rate of rejection when CCR5 is not there or is not functional. As CCR5 is normally a chemical messenger receptor, it makes sense that interfering with it would have effects of changing the immune response due to the differences in your cells communicating with each other. Going back to the emoji comparison, not having CCR5 is like when someone posts some content somewhere online using their phone. If you view that web page on a desktop, sometimes the emoji doesn't display and there's just a few characters or like an empty box outline, right? An essential part of the communication and translation is missing and isn't being sent or received properly. If you have 1 copy of the delta 32 gene and 1 copy of the normal gene, then you can still be infected with HIV, but it is much delayed and a slower progression to AIDS if untreated. In Northern European populations, up to 16% of people will have the delta 32 gene, and in Southern Europe around Greece and Sardinia, it's about 4%. It is almost entirely not present in people from Africa or Asia, which means that it evolved and sticks around not due to the selective pressures of HIV, but something else. And it makes sense now that it's not present in African countries because that's where West Nile is from, and so not having CCR5 would make you less successful at passing on your genes. If the delta 32 mutation had evolved in response to HIV, we'd likely see it more in the Africa area around Cameroon and Republic of Congo or Democratic Republic of Congo areas, but that's not the case. Some people have suggested that because of the Northern Europe connection, that it was plague that produced the mutation, as in people with delta 32 genes survived the plague better. As I've covered in Season 1, the bubonic plague would have placed a strong selective pressure on any genes that helped you survive better, simply because it was so deadly. But plague hasn't really been around in Northern Europe since the 17 and 1800s, so genes that helped you survive a disease that no one is being infected with wouldn't have any better of chance of being passed on than genes that don't help you survive, and it probably would have been lost or wouldn't be as prevalent in the population today. It has to have some purpose to currently stick around. There's some people who did complicated math and found out that between the plague and smallpox, smallpox is more capable of producing selective pressure on the delta 32 allele of CCR5 because we had smallpox around until the 1970s. So there's been more recent benefit to having the gene because smallpox was a disease of childhood. People would get smallpox as a kid and 30% would die, but if you survived, you were basically immune for life and could have babies to pass on your genes. This is a perfect example of selective pressure. It was very rare to get through childhood without encountering smallpox because it was everywhere. Anyways, I will talk more about smallpox in a couple episodes. So before this gets any closer to talking about good genes and bad genes, let me just move on. The first patient to be cured of HIV was a man named Timothy Ray Brown, and he was called the Berlin patient initially to protect his anonymity, and because he was living in Berlin when he contracted HIV in 1995. In 2006, he was diagnosed with leukemia, and in 2007, he had a bone marrow transplant. From the available matches of bone marrow donors, his doctor selected someone who had 2 copies of the CCR5 delta 32 gene, meaning they were immune to HIV. The bone marrow transplant was repeated in 2008 after a relapse. Brown had stopped taking his antiretroviral therapy the day of his first transplant, and over 3 years later, he was detected to still be free of HIV. He remained free of HIV until his death in 2020, which was unfortunately from a relapse of the leukemia. In 2019, it was reported that Adam Castillejo, known as the London patient, had also been cured of HIV after receiving a bone marrow transplant in 2016 to treat Hodgkin's lymphoma. Adam is still alive, as far as I can tell. There are others too, including the Dusseldorf patient who had a bone marrow transplant with CCR5 delta 32 stem cells. And even more amazingly, there's someone called the Geneva patient who had a bone marrow transplant without the delta 32 mutation, who is still HIV free 20 months after stopping antiretroviral therapy. Now, bone marrow transplants are not to be taken lightly. They are a big deal. You have to take a ton of drugs to help you destroy your immune system before the transplant. And afterwards, you have to worry about rejecting the transplant and all the other risks that come with any organ transplantation. It is not something we can do for 45 million people who have HIV. Bone marrow matches are not that common, unfortunately. So for now, antiretroviral therapy for life is still the way things are. In 2018, there was a bombshell that hit the scientific community when it was revealed that Chinese scientist He Jiankui edited the genome of a pair of twins before they were born using CRISPR because he wanted to protect them from HIV infection later in life. To be very simple, CRISPR is an enzyme system that we use to edit single nucleotides in DNA. A nucleotide is like the A, T, G, and C bases that code for amino acids when read in groups of 3. With CRISPR, scientists can change a genetic sequence entirely or can change a single base pair when they need to. This is a natural system that's found in bacteria, which was discovered in 2012 by Dr. Jennifer Doudna and Dr. Emmanuel Charpentier, who received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2020. Grad students in labs I've worked in have used CRISPR to knock out genes in cell culture in order to study the function of those genes. Labs around the world do this now and use it for many other things. But doing it to a human embryo is way beyond ethical boundaries, and it's frankly terrifying when it's done outside of regulations, in secret, so no one knows what's happened until you announce it, when it's done as an unnecessary thing. It's one thing to use CRISPR to treat sickle cell anemia or muscular dystrophy, which are 2 things that are ongoing, but it's another thing entirely to remove a gene that doesn't cause disease in and of itself. There are a lot of risks that come with using CRISPR, namely that it can have off-target edits. You might get it to edit the one nucleotide you want, but who knows where else it edited. You won't unless you sequence the entire genome afterwards. We can't prevent it from hitting off-target nucleotides, and that can cause a huge issue, needless to say. The thing is, even just knocking out CCR5 in mice has been shown to have positive effects on their intelligence, and it improves the way human brains recover after a stroke, on top of the above risks and benefits that I mentioned. Having known about the connection with CCR5 and intelligence, this story of trying to prevent the twins from being susceptible to HIV in the future, it feels like a flimsy cover story used to deflect blame from someone trying to create babies with designer brains. And that makes me sick. I don't have time in this podcast to go through the history of eugenics and why it's bad. This episode is long enough already, but I do have links for you, and it's easy enough to search up for yourself. So before I get really angry about discussing eugenics, I will sum it up and overall say that this movie absolutely deserves 10 out of 10 test tubes for full accuracy. They really did it justice. They tried their best and they knocked it out of the park. They got the illness, the environment surrounding it, and the people it has affected absolutely 100% correct. Okay, that is the end of this episode of Tierah Ruins Things with Science. Reminder, I am a researcher, not a doctor, so please don't take any of this as medical advice. It is for entertainment only. You can follow me on TikTok and Facebook and Blue Sky and Instagram and all the things at Tierah Ruins Things. And you can find me on Substack as well. You can get the show notes and the transcript for every episode. And if you subscribe, you'll get reading and listening lists where I share science books and other podcasts that I listen to and enjoy. Also on Substack, you can support me in ruining things by becoming a paid subscriber, or you can join my Patreon if you want, and if that platform is more your thing. With either of those subscriptions, you'll get access to all the upcoming bonus content that I've got planned and future Q&A sessions, etc., where I answer your submitted questions. I do all the research and recording and editing myself. The theme song this season was written and provided by iEffigy, and you can follow them on Spotify. There's a link. If you have suggestions for TV shows or movies, or you have questions that you want me to answer, send them in to tierahruinsthings@gmail.com, or just get in touch on any of the social medias that I mentioned. I will see you all next episode, where I will be talking about polio and the movie Warm Springs.